This movie centers around the story of a Syrian refugee boy, Munir, as he falls in love with a magnificent forest and a mysterious woman. Munir and his cousin Farid are housed together with another refugee family in a small hut deep in the woods by the Swedish Migrations Board. And though fleeing the Middle East has scarred him deeply, Munir learns to find solace in nature and embarks on a journey of exploration inside both the forest and his own thoughts. The movie starts with a title card explaining the situation of the migration. Apparently, more than 160,000 asylum seekers entered Sweden in 2015, and while the government tried its best to accommodate everyone, the numbers were just too high. So much so, even many Swedish citizens had to lend refugee families shelter in their own homes. And these first few minutes really set the tone for the rest of the film. Two cars are seen zooming through the forest toward a small little cabin hidden deep inside the woods. Farid steps out of one of the cars and lights a cigarette. He is soon followed by the other refugee family. Angela, a representative from the Swedish Migration Board, accompanies them and introduces them to Cal, the owner of the cabin. They all exchange greetings and Angela informs Cal that the families only speak English. Cal then takes over and welcomes everyone in. However, Angela notices that Munir did not get out of the car, so she proceeds to coerce him out. She asks him to come and see his home for the summer, but he quickly shuts her down, telling her that it's not his home. Eventually, Angela gives up and joins the others as Cal shows them around the house. Cal shows them the kitchen and the stove and reassures them that it's been in perfect working condition for hundreds of years. Meanwhile, Munir gets out of the car when everyone else is out of sight, but instead of joining them, heads towards the forest. Farid also spots him going in there. Munir is genuinely taken aback by nature's grandeur and feels around the trees to take it all in. Unfortunately, his little moment is interrupted by voices from his past, shouting and telling him to run. He looks around abruptly, but there's no one there. Farid, though, soon appears and tells Munir to come back, which he does. Back at the cabin, Cal is still telling everyone else about the house and area, and seeing Munir and Farid coming from the forest, warns them about the danger it poses. He tells them that though nature is very friendly and beautiful, they should still be cautious because the forest is huge, and they could get lost very easily. Then Munir and Farid head inside with the others and they both call dibs on the same bed at the same time. But Munir points out that Farid always gets the bed that's furthest in. Farid retorts with how he wanted Munir to have the better bed, then settles for the other bed. They both get into bed and Munir is once again transported back to Syria, this time to his old house where there was scarcely anything to eat. The next morning, everyone is gathered at the table quietly eating their food. But Farid breaks the silence by commenting on how all the houses in the area are red. Narina thinks it's probably because it's the only color they had, but Yusuf is determined that it has to do with the most easily accessible raw materials. But Farid is confused as to why they would still paint with the same color, and Munir chimes in that they actually paint with blood. Farid responds sarcastically, but Narina clears the air by declaring that it must have become a sort of tradition over the years. Narina even tries to change the subject by commenting on how Yusuf has almost stopped smoking since he came here, which he clarifies is because there are not many things to stress about. But Munir disagrees. He calls them out on lying, but Narina shuts him down by informing him that they're here in search of a better future. Munir tries to retort again, but this time she sternly tells him to read the Quran, and that if he continues to spread hate, she doesn't want him to eat with them at the table. When it's time for bed, Munir is having a hard time falling asleep and he tells Farid that he can hear his own thoughts. But Farid tells him to just sleep because he's not smart enough to have too many thoughts. Finally, morning rays pour in through the curtain and Munir gets up and sets off toward the forest. He decides to explore around and it's not hard to see how mesmerized he is by everything nature has to offer. He comes across a broken down cabin and heads inside to see that there are definitely signs of living. It appears that the cottage was raided and the residents were attacked. And the sight of broken glass and furniture once again takes Munir to a different world. Suddenly something reaches out from under the bed to grab him and he swiftly turns around to run, but falls back on another bed. The thing is gone, but he still gets up and prepares to go, until he looks back to hear someone calling him. His memories from Syria are back to haunt him. He shuts his eyes and covers his ears, but he can still hear the gunshots and the planes flying overhead. And worst of all, the screaming won't stop. He rushes out of the cabin and mindlessly into the forest, not caring how deep he goes. Eventually, he stops by a lake with a small white boat that he decides to borrow. He takes it near the center of the lake and lies down. He falls asleep temporarily but is again awoken from his slumber by shouts and planes flying overhead. In a frenzy, he heads back to Cal's cabin. Angela and Farid are waiting for him when he arrives. They try to confront him about where he's been, but he responds callously about how he couldn't have gone anywhere because it's all forest anyways. He also reminds Farid that it was his idea to come here in the first place. But Angela consoles Farid that he did the right thing even if Munir doesn't agree with him on it. But Farid isn't willing to let things go so easily. Hence he follows Munir to their room and interrogates him about where he spent the night, but Munir informs him that it really doesn't matter. Farid yells that there are bears out in the forest, but Munir seems unfazed and retorts that he isn't scared of bears. At this point, Farid is pretty frustrated and exclaims that he is scared of Munir and his attitude. The next day, Munir walks into Yusuf and Narina arguing over whether they need to adapt to Swedish customs or not, and interjects by asking about Farid. Upon learning that he went to the Swedes' strange rituals, he follows suit, though Narina warns him that the Swedes tend to get pretty drunk on their rituals. As Munir stands and stares at the ongoing scene of girls going around in circles, he's pulled behind a shed by Farid, who reiterates that he must not be seen by the Swedes because they're drunk and angry. Then he tells him about the ritual and how it's called Midsummer Eve because it's supposed to be the brightest day of the year. Following this, he points at the symbol they're dancing around and confidently informs Munir that it represents male. But Munir immediately brushes him off, even though Farid is still adamant. He even claims that Cal was the one to tell him about it, but Munir still doesn't believe him. Back at the cabin, Munir and Farid's window is smashed by angry Swedes calling them trash. This immediately sends Munir into a frenzy and he rushes out and punches one of the guys. Farid pulls him back, but he sets loose and tries to strike again. Later, Farid reprimands Munir for acting out but reassures him that the guy was taken into custody because he threw a stone at their window. However, if he were to prosecute, it would affect Munir's residency permit. In another one of Munir's trips into the forest, he finds a mother and daughter bathing in the lake. He recognizes them from the ritual the other day and he can't stop but stare at the beautiful daughter. He follows them all the way to their house, all the while staring right at the brunette beauty. On the other hand, back at home, Farid asks him about what he does in the forest all day, but he responds with how nobody really understands him. For Munir, the forest is healing, but Farid thinks that it's scary and lonely. Munir shoots back, claiming that the forest is completely quiet, which means that it only brings out who you are. Farid still warns him that he should be careful not to get lost in there someday. The next time Munir ventures into the woods, he sees that same girl with her friends, skinny dipping in the lake. Like every other time, he can't help but be mesmerized by her beauty. But this time, Moa's friend also spots Munir as he is himself behind a tree. She is seriously creeped out, but Moa just laughs it off. Munir quickly hides in the bushes and the voices from back home return again, urging him to run faster and save himself. And he ends up passed out in the middle of the forest. Back at the hut, Angela returns and reiterates what Farid had told Munir. The guy he had assaulted filed a police complaint, but the case might be dismissed on grounds of self-defense, but it would still affect his application for the residence permit. And she warns him that he should behave more appropriately from now on. Then she leaves, announcing that she would fill them in on any updates on the case. Munir goes back into the forest the next day and finds Moa sprawled near the lake. Without shifting her gaze, she urges him to come out. She tells him not to be afraid because she wants to make a confession. They both then introduce themselves and she encourages him to sit next to her and to look her in the eyes. She tells him that she was there the day they arrived, and she also saw him on Midsummer's Eve when he was hiding behind the shed. She recalls both events that she remembers down to the very last detail. Munir also confesses that he thought it was kind of crazy that they were dancing around a cross, especially because of Farid's description. But Moa informed him that Farid was, in fact, right, because it was a thing from the Viking Age when male was considered a symbol of life. What's more, she tells him that she saw him spying and following her mother and her the other day, and that she followed him as well. She asks him how he liked the forest and he admits that though he was scared of it at first, he loves it now. Moa then pushes that they both go for a swim in the lake, but Munir blatantly refuses, despite her persistence. So, she jokingly tells him to turn around and keep his hands where she can see them, before diving in. She holds her hand out to Munir, only to pull him right in. But as soon as she does, he starts drowning. Luckily, though, Farid seemed to have followed Munir here, and thus comes to his rescue. In fact, he starts yelling at Moa about how she purposely did this to Munir, which she obviously refutes. As for Munir, he yells at Farid to let him go, and when he doesn't comply, they both end up tumbling to the ground. An exasperated Munir exclaims that he's an adult who can handle himself. But Farid disagrees and he tells him that when Angela showed him the lake on a map, he knew that that's where Munir must have gone. He then proceeds to ask Munir if he's been intimate with Moa, and he responds, shocked as to how he thinks he could do that while he was drowning. But Farid retorts that Munir is always weird and so is the girl because that's the only thing that makes sense to him. And they continue bantering all the way home. On the other hand, Moa's mother is leaving for the city and she wants Moa to accompany her so that she can meet with her ex, Nicholas. But Moa tells her not to talk about Nicholas and she tries to pacify her by telling her that she's only doing it because she cares. While back at the cabin, Farid and Narina stare at Munir smoking a cigarette outside. Narina tells Farid that Munir is a grown-up who can very well make his own decisions, but Farid insists that he needs to look out for him. However, Narina is adamant. She tells him that Munir is in love with Moa, and it reflects in the way he glows. She tries to convince him to get off Munir's back and leave him alone, since the future is already very uncertain. Narina also tells Farid to think about making a life for himself, and he reassures her that he'll start doing that once he gets his residence permit. Nevertheless, Farid heads over to Munir and tells him that if he really wants to do something about the situation, he should actually go and talk to Moa. Meanwhile, Moa's mother bids goodbye while advising her not to roam around in the forest alone. And the next day, Munir and Moa find themselves on the boat at the lake, rowing mindlessly and coming to a stop near the center. Munir closes his eyes shut and lies down, and Moa follows suit, embracing his hand with hers in the process. And they stay that way for a while, just taking in each other's presence and enjoying the serenity of the moment. Eventually, they start rowing back to the other side of the lake. They just peacefully sit there for a while until their feelings become too overpowering. So, they end up confessing their love for one another and share an intimate moment. Munir tells Moa about how the stars are shining and that humankind just figured out how stars work to fill the sky with light, and they stay there in each other's embrace for some time. At home, Farid informs Munir that they've been called for a meeting by the migration board, but Munir pays no heed and simply heads out with Moa. Moa takes him to her house but warns that if they hear a car, he should immediately run out the back door and hide in the forest. Munir responds sarcastically because he feels unwelcome. Moa apologizes, explaining that her mother doesn't understand some things because she's afraid of them. Munir tells her that her mother is racist, but Moa is not willing to accept it, and they get into an argument over her mother. Moa tells Munir to stop calling her mother a racist, and he counters by asking her to introduce him, but she answers in the negative. And Munir states that it proves that her mother is a racist, while Moa keeps insisting that her mother is actually a really nice person. Munir responds by comparing Moa's mother to Hitler's wife Eva Braun, which seriously sets Moa off. Munir apologizes, but in vain. Moa rushes out of the house and grabs her bike. Munir follows her and continues to apologize profusely, but she refuses to accept that he called her mother a Nazi, especially since Munir doesn't even know her. Munir tries to reason that she's the one who asked him to run and hide in the forest if her mother so much as came home. He tells Moa that he's reminded every day of how unwelcome he is in Sweden only because he's an immigrant. He gets emotional and starts cursing because he isn't even sure what decision the board will ultimately make and if he'll be allowed to stay in the country or not. At this, Moa calms down and even lets out a little laugh. Munir seems flabbergasted at her laugh, and she explains that she was thinking of what her mother would do if she ever found out that she was in the house with Munir. Eventually, when things calm down, they both head down to their spot at the lake, and Moa urges Munir to share his story with her so that she can understand him better. Munir obliges and starts telling her about Syria. He begins to tell her about the time his house was blown apart. Munir is transported back to his time in Syria yet again, but this time he takes Moa with him. It was a regular day wherein Munir's mother was preparing dinner, but then he heard shouts. Initially, he thought it was just his mother, but soon realized that it was not her. And then he heard sounds again, this time like a loud buzzing. Amidst the chaos, someone coerced him to run to safety, and without even knowing what he was doing or why, he ran for his life. And then came the final blow, his house was bombed, and it all came down like a ton of bricks. The impact hit Munir as well, but he was far off enough to not be fatally injured. And so, he was saved, but his entire family passed away right in front of his eyes. A tear slid down Munir's face as he relieved that time in his head, and Moa reached out to comfort him. And, in that moment, Munir knew that she did, in fact, understand. Following that, the two lovebirds spend some time in peace, just relishing each other's company. They go on bike rides and picnics, and Moa shares her childhood albums with Munir. It really seems like the two can't keep their hands off each other. They are literally inseparable. Munir even takes Moa to meet everyone at the cabin, and they all love her too. Their story seems perfect, at least for the time being. Nevertheless, Farid keeps giving Munir reminders about the meeting with the migration board, and Munir reassures him that he will attend as expected. At her house, Moa tells Munir that Farid really loves him, which is why he's always looking out for him, and Munir admits that sometimes Farid can feel a little too overprotective. Unfortunately, though, the conversation is cut short when Moa hears her mother's car roll in and signals to Munir to stay put while she goes to check. Munir pleads that he wants to meet her mother and reasons that Moa has already met Farid. But Moa convinces him to stay and hide. At the door, Moa finds that her mother brought along an unwelcome guest, Nicholas. Her mother insists that he needed to come because he had to collect a few things. Nicholas also apologizes, saying that he understands if Moa needs her space. Moa tells him that he can't just pop in unannounced. But he reminds her that the last time they spoke, she said that she needed some time to think over the summer. And since the summer was almost over and he hadn't heard from her yet, the only logical thing to do was to drop by. With that, he reaches out to caress her, but she pulls back and tells him to stop. However, Munir has been observing the whole scene from outside, and as soon as Nicholas makes a move, Munir rushes right in. Moa's mother demands an explanation as to what he's doing inside her house, and he tells her that he's with Moa. He extends his hand for a shake, but she blatantly ignores it. And instead, she yells out for Moa until she finally comes out to find Munir with his mother. Munir demands to know about Moa and Nicholas, to which Nicholas responds that he's her boyfriend. Moa negates him, but Munir doesn't seem to believe her. Meanwhile, Moa's mother starts phoning the police about Munir. She also proceeds to reprimand her daughter for getting so close to a refugee. Blows are thrown between Nicholas and Munir, and Moa tries to stop Munir. Munir becomes exasperated and claims that she is ashamed to be with him. He then flees back to the cabin. Farid almost instantly knows something's not right when Munir shows up, and he confronts him about it, but Munir tells him that he's not a child. And upon getting another reminder for the migration board meeting, Munir claims that he doesn't care because he doesn't even want to stay in Sweden. Farid reprimands him by telling him that he doesn't know what's best for him and that he promised Munir's father that he'll take care of him, so he has to do as he says. But Munir retorts that his father never liked Farid and that Farid means nothing to him. This sends Farid into a rage as well, and he tells Munir that he is free to ruin his life if he wants. However, soon after Munir leaves, Farid and Narina are waiting and hoping for him to come back. Ultimately, Farid goes out looking for him in the forest. He keeps calling out his name but to no avail. As for Moa, she's also wandering in the forest by herself after the huge fight, but she comes across the police midway. They urge her to take them to her house, which she reluctantly does. The policemen tell Moa's mom and Nicholas to leave them alone and then explain to Moa how Munir missed his meeting with the migration board. They tell her that his application for residence permit was rejected and that she needs to tell them where he is to help him get out of this situation. And although skeptical at first, Moa decides to take them to the broken-down cabin in the woods. Once there, the two lovers are reunited and spend some intimate time together. And for a while, it seems like everything will be okay. But then as Moa tells Munir that she loves him, they're suddenly interrupted by the police. Munir feels betrayed and tells her that they've been led into a trap and that it's over for him now. He starts to escape from one of the holes in the cabin walls under the bed. Meanwhile, Farid shows up and sees the police cars parked outside. He rushes in almost at the same time as the police and is mistaken for being Munir. He grabs a knife when the police try to corner him and waits for Munir to finally make it outside from the corner of his eye. And when he does, Farid lets go of the knife and the officer pulls the trigger on him. As for Munir, who happens to see Farid get shot, he runs back to his aid but is brutally tackled to the ground and handcuffed. The police escort him to the car, and Moa wildly follows after but is restrained by another officer to prevent her from getting too close to Munir. She stands in disbelief at what she's unknowingly caused while Munir is sitting in the back of the police car that slowly drives away. And with that, the other police officer loosens his grip on Moa, who realizes that it is, now, too late to save her love. And all that's left to ask is if the love was worth the pain. And in the end, it always is, because love conquers all.